Grandma's street was always quiet. The hooting of owls and the wind rustling tree branches accompanied one of the quiet but restless nights in New Orleans. On this street, Amara listened to the sound of gravel crunching under her feet. The moonlight, combined with the tears on her face, seemed to give her a kind of cold peace. But tonight, even that peace was short-lived. Today was the hardest day of Amara's life. Years after her mother's death, she was running away from home for the first time. Her mother's soft voice echoed in her mind. A person's heart is strong, but where it breaks, it grows again. Amara was only 9 years old when she lost her mother. Cancer had quietly but mercilessly ripped her mother away from her. All that remained of those days was a worn diary and a pair of pearl earrings Amara hid under her bed. Her father had changed completely after her mother left. The house, once filled with laughter, now echoed only with anger and silence. His father's hand that had reached for the liquor bottle every evening had finally reached for Amara's safety. The escape was planned so quickly that Amara set out with only a few pieces of clothing and a sandwich. Wandering the streets, she didn't know where she would spend the night. As she sat on the cold bench of the bus stop, she took another look at the life she had left behind. He felt a loneliness as vast as the sky. It wasn't fair that while people were sleeping in their warm beds at home, he was wandering the streets to survive. But life had never been fair to her. The traumas in Amara's life were not limited to domestic violence. She was constantly ostracized and ridiculed at school. Her skin was darker than others and her hair was different. Children would call her tanned, try to touch her hair, and then run away laughing. In those days, her mother's arms were a harbor of refuge, but now Amara's harbor was only the dark streets. The lights of a police car appeared on the street. Amara crouched down, holding her breath. She was trying to make herself invisible. The consequences of being found by the authorities were no different than being back in her father's hands. As her eyes filled, a prayer escaped her lips. "Mother, protect me." As the police car drove away, Amara looked up at the sky. The moon shone like a guardian spirit, as her mother had once told her. This light could be hope for her, but that night, hope seemed as unattainable as a distant star. As the first rays of morning crept silently through the streets of New Orleans, Amara still felt the chill of the night on her skin. The day had dawned, but a kind of darkness still reigned inside her. As she shuffled her feet, she saw an old building on the corner with a sign reading Hope Outreach. The banner in front of the door read Shelter for the Homeless, Helping Hearts. She was afraid to go inside. Asking for help had always felt like a weakness for Amara, but hunger and fatigue outweighed her pride. As she stepped into the shelter, the warmth of the interior hit her in the face, and her eyes scanned the room. An old clock hanging on the wall ticked, announcing the time. People sat on plastic chairs, quietly filling their bellies with a plate of hot food and tea. Amara thought of turning back immediately, but a soft voice stopped her. "You want help, honey?" Amara turned and locked eyes with a woman in her 50s with short gray hair. Her name was Ruth. Ruth was the volunteer manager of the shelter and immediately recognized the tiredness in Amara's face. "Come, sit down. I'll fix you something," she said and led her to an empty table. Amara could not respond. She just sat down. Ruth put a plate of hot soup and some bread in front of Amara. "I want to help you, but first I need to know what happened," she said. Amara didn't want to speak at first. Her eyes were lost in the steam of the soup. But Ruth's reassuring gaze prompted her to break her silence. "My father ... double quotes," Amara said in a hoarse whisper. "My mom is dead and ... I can't stay at home." She didn't want to say more. Ruth did not finish her sentences. She just nodded. "You are safe here," she said gently. That day, Ruth arranged a bed and clean clothes for Amara. But because of the organization of the shelter, she was only allowed to stay for a few days. As Ruth listened to Amara's story, she identified the young girl's suffering with the struggles of her own youth. She decided to find a way out for Amara. The next morning, Ruth introduced Amara to the leader of a small NGO in her neighborhood. This organization provided training and job opportunities for young people in difficult situations. Amara felt a kind of lightness. For the first time in her life, an adult believed in her, reassured her that she had a future. But it was not going to be easy. The weight of the streets, traumas, and her past were still on her shoulders. Ruth reached out to Amara, trying to remind her of her own strength. "There's a light for you, honey," Ruth said, "but you have to walk to reach it." Amara promised Ruth that day, one day, as her mother said, she would grow again from the broken place. A year passed. As Amara looked up and watched the sunlight filtering through the library's large windows, she still sometimes felt like she was in a dream. The non-governmental organization she had joined with Ruth's help had not only taken her off the street, it had given her the first steps towards building a future. Now, as a high school senior, he had won a scholarship to a community leadership program and the chance to be accepted into a law school. The fears of the previous year were still vivid in her memory. This time, however, she was not giving in to her fears. Amara remembered the words Ruth had often said to her, "The past doesn't define you, but it can shape your future." These words became a mantra for her. With the support of Ruth and community leaders, she had learned to carry the weight of the violence and exclusion she had experienced. That weight would one day make her a powerful voice. Now Amara was not only telling her story, she was fighting to give others a voice. Today, at an event organized with the community's young leaders, Amara would take the podium for the first time. As she stood in front of the crowd, her breath quickened. The eyes of hundreds of people were focused on her. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Amara Davis. For a long time I have kept myself silent. Violence, poverty, and exclusion have defined my life. But now I know that I have a place in this world. I have a voice, and you have a voice too." The silence in the hall was suddenly filled with applause. Amara felt a lump in her throat at the warmth she saw in people's eyes. In that moment, she knew that she represented not only herself, but all the people who, like Ruth, had lent a helping hand in the past. After the event, Ruth emerged from the crowd and walked towards Amara. Her eyes were filled with pride. "Your mom would be so proud to see you," Ruth said, hugging Amara tightly. In that hug, all that was missing in Amara's life seemed to be complete for a moment. Although she had not left her mother, her past, and her pain behind, she had learned to turn them into a source of strength. On her way home at night, she looked up at the star-filled sky. The hope inside her was as bright as those stars shining in the darkness. Her fears no longer ruled her, they were building blocks for her future. Amara was on her way to changing not only her life, but the lives of many young people who had experienced similar traumas. That night, her mother's voice echoed in her mind once again. "A person's heart is strong, but where it breaks, it grows again."